Today, we're going to challenge the map of the world that you probably have in your head. We're going to uncover a history that wasn't just forgotten, but was actually hidden. And by doing that, we might just change how we see the entire modern world.
So let me ask you something. When you picture the world back in 1450, right before Columbus set sail, what do you see? If you're like most of us, you probably picture a map with Europe right in the middle, and everything else is just kind of out there on the edges. But what if that whole picture is just wrong?
You see, that mental map we all have is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. To really see what was going on, we have to shift our focus. We need to look away from Europe and towards what was, in many ways, the true center of the world at the time.
So, here's the trick. Instead of starting with Europe, let's just zoom out. When we do that, we see that the known world of the 15th century wasn't a bunch of isolated continents at all. Nope, it was a deeply interconnected system. Africa, Europe, Asia, they were all tied together by constant trade and movement.
And the difference is pretty shocking, right? On one side, you have the myth, this idea of an isolated Africa, just waiting for someone to show up. But the reality? The reality was a continent that was a powerful central hub in this huge, vibrant Afro-Eurasian network.
And look, this isn't just some new theory. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Ancient Greek writers saw North Africa as a core part of their world. Islamic scholars and travelers wrote all about these massive trade routes crisscrossing the Sahara and the Indian Ocean. And crucially, a lot of the gold that was funding medieval Europe, it was coming directly from West Africa. This was not an isolated place.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to the famous traveler Ibn Battuta. He was writing about a city in West Africa almost a full century before 1450. He described, in his own words, a great city, one of the finest, biggest, whose inhabitants are rich. That was the reality on the ground.
So you have to ask, right? If Africa was this central, connected, thriving place, what on earth happened? How did the story change so completely? Well, that brings us to a huge turning point, a moment when the entire world kind of tilted on its axis.
And this, right here, is the most important thing to get. The age of exploration didn't create a global system out of nothing. That system was already there. What European powers did was violently hijack those existing networks. They redirected the world's flow of wealth and power and pointed it all towards themselves.
And you can see just how fast this all went down. In the late 15th century, European states start projecting their power outward. Suddenly, the world's economic center shifts from those ancient Mediterranean and Indian Ocean routes to the new Atlantic ones. This was the birth of new empires and a totally new world order. And this created a whole new stage for history to play out on. Historians call it the Atlantic world, this new global space connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it was a place of contradictions, defined by this intense exchange of goods and ideas, but also by unimaginable violence and the forced labor of millions of people.
Okay, so a massive historical shift happens. But how did the story of that shift get so twisted? Why was Africa's central role not just forgotten, but actually erased from the history books? The answer, well, it shows us how history itself can be used as a weapon.
To really get your head around the mindset that allowed this to happen, you have to look at what was being written by influential European thinkers centuries later. This quote, it's just genuinely shocking. It's a flat-out declaration that an entire continent and its people simply have no history worth talking about.
But this wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. Oh no, this myth of an unhistorical Africa served a very specific and very brutal purpose. If you argue that a place has no history or culture of its own, then you can justify enslavement. You can legitimize building an empire. You can even frame colonial conquest as some kind of rescue mission.
And this all leads to a really stunning historical irony. I mean, stop and think about that for a second. You have centuries of intense, violent, deeply connected history between Europe and Africa. And the story that comes out of it is that Africa was never really there in the first place. The very interaction itself was used to create a story of absence.
Thankfully, the story doesn't end there. It took a long time, but historians finally started to push back. In the 1950s and 60s, as African nations were fighting for and winning their independence, a new generation of scholars began to tear down these old myths. They built the modern field of African history from the ground up, using new evidence and, for the first time, African sources to finally set the record straight.
Which brings us to the big picture, and why all this matters so much. This isn't just about adding a missing chapter to a history book. It's about realizing we might need to reread the entire book from a completely new perspective.
And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is a fascinating history lesson, but why does a 500-year-old story really matter to me today? Well, it matters profoundly, because the stories we tell about the past directly shape how we understand the world we live in right now.
Changing your historical starting point changes, well, everything. Look at global trade. In that old Eurocentric view, it's basically a European invention. But in the corrected view, it's the redirection of a system that was already there. That single shift completely changes how we understand the roots of our global economy and modern inequality.
And this really is the whole point. Getting this history right isn't just about Africa. A Eurocentric view doesn't just push one continent to the side, it gives everyone a twisted, incomplete picture of how our modern world actually came to be. It tells the wrong origin story for all of us.
So I'll leave you with the same question that historians are still grappling with, a question that reframes everything we think we know. How does our story of the last 500 years of human history change when we stop seeing Africa as a footnote and start seeing it as a central driving force? The answer changes everything.